Recently, I have received a few requests in my comments to make a video that gathers together all of my favorite books. I'm guessing to serve as like a reference point or a vibe check for like people who are new to my channel coming in, like consuming my newer content. And on top of that, I have just hit 50,000 subscribers. So this video is a little bit daunting, but I thought to celebrate, I would gather together my 50 favorite books that I have read because of Booktube. So straight off, thank you so much for 50k. I cannot believe that I'm here. Like, thinking back on where I started in 2017 with this channel, 50k was not even something that I could ever dream about. So to be here right now and also to have 50 books that I not necessarily would never have read, but read directly because of this platform, honestly blows my mind, especially because if you are consuming recent content, you'll know that I've been having a little bit of an identity crisis where I can't find books that I enjoy. Like, I'm DNFing more than ever. I have less and less 5 stars, and honestly it was just so refreshing and invigorating to look back over my last 8 years on this platform and see all of these books that I adore and just think about them and hold them in my hands again while I put them together for this video. If you are a long time watcher of this channel, you may know that some of these series that I always talk about, that I say that I love and enjoy, are not going to be in this video, and the main reason for that is that I probably read them before Booktube. So just off the top of my head, a few notable ones that I'm not going to be talking about today are the A Court of Thorns and Roses series and also Throne of Glass by Sarah J Maas. There's Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. There is, what else have I read? The Grisha trilogy by Leigh Bardugo, The Mortal Instruments by Cassandra Clare, the not Vampire Academy necessarily, but Bloodlines specifically by Rochelle Mead. All of that is stuff that I had read pre-Booktube that I do often reference as some of my favorite series, which is also why all of those are like, oh, the Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer, all very notable like young adult series. I am going to try and remember where I got these recommendations from if I can. I know obviously it's been a long time, so some of them have faded from my memory, but some I have very clear, distinctive like recollections of where I got these, like why I read these books. But all of them, some way, somehow, I have read because of my time here on YouTube. So obviously we're going to be talking about 50 today, and something that I am not known for is being concise. Like, I generally give quite detailed synopses of books. In my monthly wrap-ups, in my general 5-book recommendation videos, I talk about them for like a considerable amount of time, like a good amount of time. But we're going to get through 50 today, so I'm going to try and curb myself, and I'm going to tell you as short as a synopsis as I can give and my favorite thing about them to try and keep this moving with a little bit of pace. But I have also broke them down into genre, and the genres we're going to be tackling today, I have just one non-fiction, I have horrors and thrillers like grouped together, sci-fi and dystopian, I have romance and contemporary fiction, there's fantasy romance, and then for the fantasy as a whole, we have 4 different categories here. We have a lot of adult fantasy, and I've split that into things that I would consider more epic fantasy and adult fantasy that just is not epic. We also have historical fantasy, because I had quite a few of those, and also middle grade fantasy. So I'm going to start in a weird place. I'm going to start with the non-fiction because I only have one and I also don't own it, so I don't want to forget about it. But that is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doughty. If you don't know Caitlin Doughty, they are a mortician on YouTube. So they have a channel where they talk about like mortuary practices, death culture, all of that stuff. And this first non-fiction from them served as like a kind of memoir of little anecdotes and experiences from their time working in a morgue. Now, I have read all of Caitlin Doughty's non-fiction, including Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs, and also I can't remember the name of it, but there is one about different death practices in different cultures around the world, and I have really enjoyed all of them. The thing that I really like about Caitlin Doughty's channel and these non-fiction in general is that they are promoting people being open-minded and knowledgeable about death to the point where, like, obviously it's always going to scare you, but if you know a little bit more about it, you are more likely to talk about it and kind of break down the stigma stigma surrounding like death, like funerals and all of that kind of stuff. I kind of was going to leave the fantasy until last because it is the biggest section, but I think we should actually go through it first because it is like the genre that I would say that I'm dominantly known for. I think fantasy romance as well, which is actually quite a small stack, but fantasy I would say is the one. I'm going to start off with the middle grade. The first one doesn't have a dust jacket because I picked this up off eBay because I really wanted the hardback, and it just didn't, I didn't say it didn't have a dust jacket, but it didn't, and it was quite affordable in comparison to the rest of them. But that is Nevermore, The Trials of Morrigan Crow by Jessica Townsend. This one is about a cursed child called Morrigan Crow who is destined to die on, I think it's like her 10th or 11th birthday, but instead she is swept away by this guy called Jupiter North and taken to the magical city of Nevermore, where she is enrolled in a magical academy called Woonsock, or the Wondrous Society, Woonsock is for short, and ends up embroiled in like a little bit of a larger plot. The thing that I love the most about this is that it is so immersive that it feels believable. Like, I could believe that Nevermore is a place that I could go to if only I knew how to access it, and I think that level of immersion and how real it felt to me with the description is why I love this series so much. The other one is, it's a middle grade fantasy. I think that this is one of the books that just kind of stands on its own as like a fantasy book. If you read it at any age, you would take something different away from it because it does also have like a strong romantic plot in here as well. But that is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. This one is following a young girl called Sophie who is cursed by the Witch of the Wastes into the body of an old woman. So she decides that this is going to be a turning point in her life, and she goes out into the hills and she stumbles across Howl's Moving Castle, which is ruled of course by the wizard Howl, who is known for eating little girls' hearts. However, when she arrives at Howl's Moving Castle and she starts to talk to like the enchanted creatures, I guess, that inhabit it, she finds out that Howl is not necessarily all that he seems. This story just swept me away going into it thinking it was a middle grade fantasy. I didn't expect the depth that it would provide for an adult reader and the enjoyment it could provide for an adult reader. And my favorite thing about it, I guess, is how it does have this strong romantic plot that as a romance reader and a romance lover just absolutely swept me away, but it doesn't detract away from the fact that this is like a middle grade story and it's full of whimsy and imagination and reminds me of like a fairy tale or like a children's story that stands the test of time that you could read time and time again throughout your life and take something different from it each time. I guess the next shortest stack is the historical fantasy. The first one is a very recent read of mine and I very much need to continue on with this series, and that is The Pomegranate Gate by Ariel Kaplan. So this was a 4-star read and the vast majority of books in this video are 5s, but I have added I think around like 6 to 10 4-star reads, and they're essentially books that didn't get a full 5 but I'm still thinking about in spite of it being a while since I read them. So I read this like a year and a half ago now and it lives in my mind rent free. This is a story of 2 main characters. One is a young woman who can speak but can't shout, and she can walk but she can't run. And this is set at a time, it's in a fictional version of medieval Spain, but set in a time period when the Jewish people of Spain were being converted to Christianity. The Christians said to them, like, you can be converted or you can leave. So our 2 main characters choose to leave, and when they are in a caravan leaving the city, our female main character, because of being unable to shout, being unable to run, is herded away by somebody who means to take advantage from her, and our male main character sees that, so he follows her into the woods where she disappears through the Pomegranate Gate into a different dimension. So he then goes to find her guardians and finds her grandparents and ends up on a quest with his grandmother to try and save this girl from the dimension that she's fallen into. Meanwhile, she is learning about this other realm which has fantastical creatures, reminding me a little bit of the City of Brass in that regard, in that area of it, and seeing how very closely the corruption in this realm she has fallen into mirrors the corruption and upheaval that is happening in the real world as well. What was my favorite thing about this? There was a lot that I really enjoyed about this, and I feel like it deserves to be a 5, honestly, just because of how often I think about it. But I think the thing that I loved about this is how seamlessly it wove together these 2 different narratives happening in 2 different places in a way that kept me gripped and immersed the entire time. If you are a fan of the next series I'm going to mention, which is vastly more popular than this one, which is the Winter Night Trilogy by Catherine Arden, and also City of Brass, I think you will really love this one. And then of course we do have the Winter Night Trilogy by Catherine Arden. So my favorite thing to read about in historical fantasy is the time in the world, generally in Europe, when Christianity was sweeping through the continent and converting everybody from the old gods that they previously worshipped, like each country's individual folklore, and converting them to Christianity, and the way that fantasy authors have taken a certain take on this. So this was my first instance of encountering that, because in this one we are following a young woman who is called Vasya, and she lives in Russia. She lives out in the countryside, but she has noticed that the old gods are dying because people are no longer giving them tribute, and I'm pretty sure it's her father's new wife has entered into the household and actually sees demons, so she has swung like completely the opposite way to devout Christianity to combat these visions that she has. And I think that the fact that she is a member of the household brings a priest to the household to further convert the people of this town and turn them away from the old gods. But as someone who can see the old gods, Vasya takes it upon herself to try and save them from their imminent like doom. The series as a whole, this mainly focuses on the folklore, but the series as a whole deals with also the political climate at the time and some of the wars that were happening in Russia in this time, which I can't remember specifically, but it might be around the 1400s. I think my favorite thing about this one is the discussions that arise from setting a book in a time period where Christianity is new and it is fresh, and there is a religion that like these people follow before, and how that is affected by Christianity, and also bring into life these folkloric elements that we now do consider story that people once considered religion. And this does also have a romance plotline in it that I really enjoyed. A pretty recent read for me was Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is a book that I actually expected to hate, but ended up really enjoying. This one is set in a time period that I notoriously do not like. It is the early 1800s, 1836 to be specific. And we are following a boy called Robin who has been taken by a rich white man from the Canton region of China to be enrolled into Oxford to benefit the British Empire. So the magic system in here is silverworking, and the people who are best at silverworking are people who are fluent in a language that isn't English. So Robin is useful because he speaks Mandarin, and he is raised in this rich man's home, very much othered by this man and also pretty much every white person he meets, and enrolled into Oxford in the translation school, which is the only school that accepts women and people of colour, to play his part in strengthening the British Empire by reinforcing and continuing to produce these silver bars that are allowing the British Empire to have such a hold on the rest of the world. So I expected to hate this because it's dark academia, which I do find overly pretentious. It's also set in a time period that I, like I said, notoriously do not like. My favorite thing about this is also kind of my least favorite thing about this. I liked the way that systemic and subtle racism was highlighted in this book, but I don't like that R.F. Kuang then took every instance and explained it to a point where like I don't feel like it fostered independent thought on behalf of the reader. But I do like the way that this is a book about colonialism and racism, but it is also a fantasy novel, and for me, while it's very obvious that it is about racism and colonialism, they also kind of work seamlessly in building the fantasy plotline. Like, it's not like there is no fantasy plot. They work very well in tandem to build a cohesive novel. One that is also really weird to me, but this is just a book that I cannot forget about, and that is The Embroidered Book by Kate Hartfield. Now, one of the reasons why enjoying historical fantasy is always so surprising to me is because typically, like, I'm not somebody who knows a lot about history. It was never something I was interested in at school, and it's never something that I particularly looked into in my adult life either. So I will say that I think that the author took a lot of liberties with the characters in this book, because it mainly follows Marie Antoinette and paints her in a little bit of a sympathetic light, which I know vaguely from my comments is not like the popular opinion on Marie Antoinette at all. But this is set in 1768. It does follow the girls from childhood. It's Marie Antoinette and her sister, who is Charlotte, and they find this embroidered book, which is a book of spells. Now, obviously, they both grow up to become queens. Marie Antoinette becomes the Queen of France, and Charlotte becomes, I think, the Queen of Naples. Napoli, and it is about how they use these spells in their daily life to get by at a time that was very turbulent in Europe, and they end up kind of on different paths. Like one of them follows more like an underground way of using magic, while one of them joins this like official group of men who like control and police all of the magic. And I mean, to be honest, it ends terribly for both of them, because this does end in a place where it ended in real life, like with the beheading of Marie Antoinette, which is not a spoiler because the only real thing that I knew about Marie Antoinette picking this book up is that she was the Queen of France and she was beheaded. My favorite thing about this is that it made me interested in a time period that I wasn't particularly interested in looking into in any detail. It humanized historical figures, and while, like I said, Marie Antoinette does not necessarily deserve to be sympathized with, I really liked the emotional reaction that this kind of pulled out from me, because I know what happens to Marie Antoinette, and going through this and having her endeared to me throughout the course of this book to know where it ends made me more emotionally invested in it than I feel like I would have been otherwise. And then the last historical fantasy is one that I also do not own. It is Gods of Jade and Shadow by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. This one is also reminiscent of the Winter Night trilogy for me, in that it is a historical fantasy with a romantic plotline, and it is following a girl who is living with her grandfather, and because of her mother's life choices, which her family don't approve of, she is treated as a servant in this household, and she is left to like sweep the floors while she dreams of a better life for herself. I'm pretty sure this is in the Jazz Age, which, I mean, like I said, history is not my forte, but isn't that the 1920s, the 1930s? And when Cassiopeia is cleaning one day, she accidentally disturbs the bones of a Mayan god of death who sends her on a quest, I'm pretty sure, to free him from a curse that was maybe put on him by his brother. It is a standalone historical fantasy, and once again, one of my favorite things about this one and why I love historical fantasy is that it got me interested in a time period that I previously knew nothing about. I also really love these formats of having like a human girl and like an ancient god, but in a little bit of a more literary light than painted in like a typical fantasy romance, with more maybe like historical accuracy in there as well, as opposed to books that have similar plots but lean a little bit more paranormal romance where the romance is at the forefront. In Gods of Jade and Shadow, it's more about the time period and also the plot than it is about the romance, but the romance makes it extra interesting for me. Let us do the adult fantasy that is not epic fantasy first, starting off with The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune, which is what some people would consider a cozy fantasy. I feel like the stakes are a little bit higher for that. I would just say it's like a heartwarming kind of fantasy, but this one was a standalone when I read it, and I read the sequel, didn't love it. But it is following a man who is a like social worker for magical children, and he is sent by his superiors to the House on the Cerulean Sea, which is a home that contains the world's deadliest, like most dangerous magical creatures, and he's sent to report on how the home is being run to make sure that the children are safe and cared for. But it is actually because his management are like trying to build a case against these children who are just trying to live their lives. I don't read a lot of heartwarming stuff, tend to read stuff that's more like dark and tragic, and that's what I really enjoy. But then sometimes I pick up something like this and it's just what I need, and it makes me just feel, and it just warms my heart and is really wholesome. So I think my favorite thing about this one is the magical children. I loved the heartwarming vibes and how emotionally invested I got in this, but I loved getting to know these individual children and the level of imagination that TJ Klune has put in here to create these kids that are monsters, but also like make them, they're incredibly endearing. I love the way that they interact with each other and the humor they add to the story. And once again, there is also a romantic plotline in this that I really enjoyed. Another standalone fantasy is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V. Schwab. Now, there is going to be another V. Schwab book in this video, but generally this is an author that is very hit or miss for me. V. Schwab has written some of my favorite books and also some of my least favorite books, which is wild, but The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is one that swept me away. It is once again quite romantic in nature, but it is following a young woman who, this one doesn't have a synopsis, which is really annoying, you know, like when you need to refresh. But I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, she is about to be married to a man that she does not want to be married to at some point in the past. I can't remember how old she is, but she's like a couple of 100 years old, and she makes a bargain with a god in the woods to get her out of this marriage, but it makes it so that nobody she ever meets will ever remember her. So she floats through the decades, the centuries, without ever having any companionship or friendship, because as soon as she leaves these people's like line of sight, they forget that they ever had an interaction with her. And one day, I'm pretty sure she's in a bookstore and she meets somebody who remembers her for the first time in all of these years. So my favorite thing about this is that it is a little bit of a tragic love story. Not necessarily that it ends badly, but just the whole nature of this book, like the feeling that you have when you're reading it, is just full of things like longing, and it has a very bittersweet tone to it, because throughout this, like, we're having flashbacks of Addie's life and how she got up to this point, and it's just full of so much longing and so much loneliness that even the happy moments in here have that little tinge of sadness underneath them. Things like this that are romantic in nature but you wouldn't necessarily call like a cut and dry romance and have a lot of like sadness in them are my favorites. Like some of my favorite movies: Titanic, Moulin Rouge, Romeo and Juliet. Like, I am a sucker for something that is romantic but also sad, and this definitely hit that spot. The last, I think, of the adult standalone fantasies is another one that I do not own, the last one that I don't own actually, and one that I want to reread, which is An Unkindness of Magicians by Kat Howard. Now, this recently got a sequel, but honestly I waited so long for it that it wasn't something that I was super excited about anymore. But I think about this book quite a lot, so I would really like to reread it. This one is about a magical tournament. It reminds me a lot of All of Us Villains, which is a more recent release by Amanda Foody and Christine Lynn Herman that I also enjoyed, but it is about a magical tournament that happens in New York City between all of these old magical families, and I think that the prize is that that family gets to govern the magic wielders of New York for the next however long, like I think it's something like 10 or 20 years, and our main character of An Unkindness of Magicians is a newcomer in this tournament, and I'm pretty sure there's nothing about the rules that says that she can't enter, but it is incredibly strange for somebody who is not affiliated with any of these families to be a contender in this tournament. My favorite thing about this, I would say, is how much it packs into it being a standalone. I thought that it had a good amount of character development while mainly being plot driven, and as somebody who doesn't love contemporary fantasy, like I definitely prefer high fantasy, I really liked how it wove these like tournaments and the magic within New York City, which is a city that I've been to and a city that I love. Something that could be considered fantasy romance, I've put it in the fantasy category because back when I read this, it was when fantasy romance wasn't really a thing. So in my mind, it's firmly in the fantasy category, but I completely understand why people would consider this duology a fantasy romance, and that is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This is one of the first books that I read because of Booktube. I think it was published in 2018, with me joining in 2017. Oh, this was published in 2017, late 2017, I think. Laini Taylor was already pretty well known in the community because Daughter of Smoke and Bone, so this was just a book that everyone was reading, so I of course also picked it up. And this is the story of a man called Laszlo Strange, who is an archivist. I think he's a junior librarian, and he dreams of this city called Weep that used to exist but nobody remembers its name. Like, there is a moment where this city was erased from the minds of everybody who knew it, and now it's just referred to as Weep. So Laszlo has dedicated his life to finding out what happened to the mysterious city of Weep, and one day an expedition comes to his library and says that they are going to be heading to the city of Weep and invites him to come with them, so he obviously jumps at the chance. Now, my favorite thing about this is Laini Taylor's writing style. I don't always love a flowery writing style if I feel like it's just a lot of words saying not a lot of things, but the depth of atmosphere that Laini Taylor creates with the lush descriptions of this world really sold this for me. And also, once again, it is a series that has a lot of sadness underpinning it, even though once again it does have a strong romantic plot line in here. A contemporary fantasy and also a recent series. This is a series of 4 stars for me, but they're ones that I think of with a lot of fondness, which you'll know because I do talk about them quite a lot, and that is the Her Majesty's Royal Coven series by Juno Dawson. So this this one is set in the north of England, and it is following a group of women who used to be part of the same coven when they were growing up. And since then there has been a war with the warlocks of the world, and they have all gone their separate ways. But the two of this group that really start off this story, one of them is now the High Priestess of Her Majesty's Royal Coven in Manchester, which is the like governing body, the UK's governing body of witches. And then we also have Neve, who is still staying, like she still lives in their hometown, and she uses her magic on a day-to-day basis to help her in her job as a vet. There is a prophecy in this world that a figure called the Sullied Child is going to be discovered, and they are going to summon the demon that brings about the end of days. So when Helena, who is the High Priestess, thinks that she's found this child, she contacts Neve and asks Neve to rehabilitate the child to stop them from summoning the demon that heralds the end of days. This is a story, like with Babel, it deals with contemporary topics while still being a very strong fantasy series. This one is about predominantly like LGBTQ plus rights, but also intersectionality and the prejudice that is still very commonplace within a lot of like official institutions. My favorite thing about this is that it's set in the north of England. It's set in Hebden Bridge, which is close to where I went to university. It's not somewhere that I've ever lived, but like my city, like my closest home city was Manchester, and Manchester is my favorite city in the country. So the fact that this is more set in the north of England than the south, which is what we typically get with books that are written in the UK, I really loved, because not only did I really love the storyline in general, I loved how relatable it was to me and how familiar it felt because of the setting. Now this is one that I love the first two books in this series. I was very recently greatly let down by the final book, but that is The Final Strife by Sarah El-Arifi, which is the first book in the Ending Fire trilogy. Now this one is an adult fantasy. This is one that I'm like, you could consider it to be epic, but it is just a trilogy, and considering the scope of a lot of the other books that I have, I would say that this is just like a high fantasy series. And it is set in a world where people are divided by blood color. We have red bloods who are nobility, blue bloods are like the workers and are also oppressed, but then we also have the translucent bloods who are the most oppressed and are like a servant or slave class. There was also a rebellion in this world where some of the blue and red-blooded babies were swapped so that the rebellion could raise red-blooded children amongst the lower classes so that they could see the oppression and enter them into a series of trials that picks the next leaders of the world so that they could eventually change the world for the better. My favorite thing about this book, I would say maybe the battle drum is my favorite in the series, but this book, I kept saying like this is the best start to a new fantasy series that I've read in a long time, and even being disappointed with book 3, I still very much stand by that. But this book in particular, I feel did a very good job of introducing you to the characters and the world while having a very common and also tight plot structure, because you're mainly following this tournament that's gonna pick the next leaders of the world and the main characters that we follow that end up entering it. And then right at the end, it introduces just this little inkling that lets you know that the world is bigger than you thought it was. And then book 2 really expands upon that. So I feel like in terms of this being a trilogy, the first 2 books were executed in exactly the way that I love fantasy trilogies to be executed. And sadly, like the ending just didn't really land for me. It wasn't great, but would still recommend Sarah El-Arifi. I've enjoyed everything that I've read from this author. And then this one is a grimdark trilogy along with Strange the Dreamer. I think that this was actually the first book that I picked up because of Booktube. Once again, everyone was reading this at the time. I'm gonna say it was published once again in 2017. Oh, and I forgot that it's signed. 2016, this one, wow. And it is Nevernight by J. Kristoff. This still always goes down as one of my favorite series of all time. I love it. I've reread the first 2 books a couple of times, and I would love to reread the whole series again. Once again, I do think that the 3rd book in this series is the weakest, but I still love it as a whole. And this one is following a girl called Mia who sees her parents executed, and so she kind of bides her time. She's raised by a guy, I'm pretty sure he runs a shop, and when she comes of age, she goes to this notorious school of assassins to learn the skills that she needs to take revenge for the death of her parents. However, they were executed by like the government, so this is not going to be an easy easy task. And throughout the series, you definitely learn that there is a level of corruption running throughout this entire system, which, I mean, are we surprised? My favorite thing about this is everything. I mean, the atmosphere, for one, especially when we get to the assassin school, which is my favorite part of this entire series. I just thought the vibes were immaculate in that particular setting. And also the main character of Mia, I adore with my whole heart. She's definitely flawed, and I feel like now I definitely pick holes in characters more than I ever used to, but I will love Mia forever, and I will always recommend this series. It's so like close to my heart. For the epic fantasies, I feel like this is going to be very predictable of me. We do have multiple different things by the same authors as well, so I'm going to kind of talk about them together. We do of course have a lot of catch-up book club picks in here as well, starting off with Catch-Up Book Club's biggest hit today, maybe our biggest hit ever, which is The Realm of the Eldlings. So I could have cheated and I could have included everything apart from the Real World Chronicles in this video, but I decided to pick Assassin's Apprentice being the first book of Fitz's arc, and The Ship of Magic, which is the first book in the Live Ship Traders, which is my favorite trilogy within the Realm of the Eldlings. So I do actually have a full video on the Realm of the Eldlings if you guys would like to go check that out, like a complete guide if you're wanting to get into it. But essentially every other series follows this boy called Fitz, who is the bastard son of the prince in waiting. He is abandoned by his maternal grandfather and taken to his father, Prince Chivalry, who is so ashamed that he has had a son out of wedlock that he leaves the castle and abdicates the throne, leaving Fitz raised by the stable master Burrich. You can't say more for the setup of this book, but just know that Fitz's story is one of the saddest that you will ever read, and you are going to cry your way through the entire Realm of the Eldlings. This isn't just one book, this is Fitz's entire story, why this stands in. And my favorite thing about this is the journey, like the journey that you go on with Fitz and the Fool, and the emotions that you feel throughout this. It is honestly one of the best fantasy stories that I have ever read, and I've probably never been invested in anything for 15 books like I was invested in this. Would definitely recommend, if you are a fantasy reader and you have not read the Realm of the Eldlings yet, please do. It is very slow though, so if you're somebody who likes much faster paced, like plot heavy books, it might not be for you. And then the other Robin Hood book, of course, is the Live Ship Traders, my favorite trilogy within the Realm of the Eldlings. This one is following the people who work on live ships. So live ships are ships that are sentient and they run within a family. Like the family members that operate them die on the decks and their blood seeps into the wood and gives these ships like more life. And it is following some of the families that own the live ships in this world. It is an epic fantasy within itself, within just the trilogy, without the connections it has to the Realm of the Eldlings as a whole. And it is a pirate story and like a seafaring adventure story. The reason why I love the Live Ship Traders so much within the Realm of the Eldlings is because I feel like as a trilogy it stands on its own and it is the best in that regard. It's just like more solid. It's the most solid section of the Realm of the Eldlings, and I think plot wise it has the tightest plot as a trilogy. We might as well run through the other catch-up book club pick that we have in here, which is of course Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. Now my two favorite books within this series are actually A Storm of Swords and A Dance of Dragons, but also I think Game of Thrones, the first book, comes in as my third favorite maybe overall. And this, of course, we all know Game of Thrones. It is the story of a group of influential families, like high houses of lords and ladies, fighting over who is going to sit on the throne after the death of the king. Meanwhile, something fantastical and very fatal to their entire species is happening and they're just all ignoring it while they're fighting amongst themselves. That's not usually how I describe Game of Thrones, but honestly I think it's the most accurate description. My favorite thing about Game of Thrones, I think, is the grey morality, and that is something that I feel like I first encountered in this series that has become a staple of fantasy series that I love. I like it when you have to defend why you like a character. Like if you pick a favorite character in Game of Thrones, I love Jaime Lannister. He does some terrible stuff like from the get-go, and you have to like, I love Robb Stark as well. They're probably my two favorites if I'm being honest. But to say that a character in the series is your favorite, you have to either excuse or defend the terrible things that they've done, which makes sense because they're all human, they're all flawed, they all do both bad things and good things, and it's about picking kind of like the best of the bunch, I guess. But the reason why I love that so much in in the context of Game of Thrones is that there is no clear winner here. There's no clear good side for you to follow. Things are shifting constantly and you can like different factions and different characters for different reasons, and that keeps you on your toes like throughout this. I also think that George R.R. Martin is a amazing plotter. Like the little subtle hints that he weaves throughout his books that I hope are going to come into fruition at some point if this series is ever finished. So I really like series where you can get into the nitty gritty and like discuss the foreshadowing and the little things that are said that aren't super prominent in the text, and Game of Thrones provides all of that. And I have of course included these as favorites because of Booktube, because I'd already started watching, I'm pretty sure, Game of Thrones before I had a channel, but I would not have read them and finished them had I not had a book club that I created for Booktube. While we're talking about the big long fantasy series, we do of course have to mention Brandon Sanderson. Now, for some reason, for every other series, I have brought out like the first book to kind of represent the author or the series, but for the Stormlight Archive, I've brought Oathbringer specifically, which I know is my favorite book. This is just counting as one book for this video as well, not two. And I've also brought The Final Empire. So if you don't know what Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere is, it is kind of like the Realm of the Eldlings in that it is a group of series that are all somewhat interlinked, but I feel like the Realm of the Eldlings has a more linear narrative structure. Like you get to a certain point in the Realm of the Eldlings where you know why the Life Ship Traders is connected to it, and the Rainwild Chronicles is apparent like why it's connected to it the more you read. Whereas I feel like the way that the Cosmere is linked is a lot more subtle. You can read everything as a separate series, you don't have to read them all, but they all do link together as being set in the same universe. So my two favorite Cosmere series are Mistborn Era 1, don't talk to me about Era 2, and also the Stormlight Archive. So Mistborn is about a man called Kelsier who is putting together a team to kill the Dark Lord who rules the Final Empire. So it is like a little bit of a heist story set in a high fantasy world. My favorite thing about, I haven't thought about this. What is my favorite thing about Mistborn? I think it is how compelling it is for this first book especially, which is my favorite in the trilogy. It's 640 pages. I think that Brandon Sanderson does a good job throughout the majority of his Cosmere series of keeping you very interested. I love Sanderson's writing style because he is a very complex author, but the complexity of his work is within the plot and also the world. It is not the writing style. Like his writing style is not dense at all, which I feel provides a perfect entry point for fantasy readers and also helps you to keep incredibly like engaged throughout the process of reading his books. And of course, my favorite thing about Sanderson as a whole is his plot twists, which is definitely the reason why Oathbringer is my favorite. So the Stormlight Archive is a very, very difficult one to describe. It is the most complex of Sanderson's work. It is the slowest pace. It is the most dense, and it is one where you really have to wait for the payoff of this series. To start off with, I guess, it is following a war between the humans, the Alethi especially, which is like a kingdom of the humans, and a different race called the Parshendi, and they are fighting over resources because the Parshendi possess valuable resources that help the humans to thrive. But the reason why they're fighting right at this very moment is because they had a party to negotiate a peace treaty, and the Parshendi assassinated the Alethi king. So at the very beginning of this series, every perspective you follow is somewhat tied to the Alethi side of the war. So you follow one of the generals, you follow a slave in one of the armies, you follow the assistant to the daughter of the king that was assassinated. That is not what the series is about at all, but that is all I can tell you about it. It does have key points of the actual plot of the series are things like legendary knights and legendary weapons and this different realm that's integral in the creation of the world. But as I said, one of my favorite things about Sanderson is his plotting, and the reason why I love Oathbringer so much is because so many of those plot points that have been coming up time and time again come into fruition in Oathbringer. And the way that Brandon Sanderson, wow, that's the second time I've said Brandon this week, but the way that Brandon Sanderson reveals things is in a way where as soon as he has said what the plot reveal is, you can see every single time that this has been brought up throughout the course of the book. He's very good at distracting you, so he will be telling you the plot reveal, but almost explicitly, but without context throughout the entirety of the book. But he'll be distracting you and he's like, no, actually look at this shiny thing over here. I've just said this, but look at this over here. So you're paying more attention to the thing happening over here than the thing over here that's actually relevant, to the point where like when the plot reveal happens, you are blown away by it, but you can also see like every step of plotting along the way. We still have 30 books to go, so being concise is not working. But one of my favorite books, like the only book that I read in 2024 I would say that is a new favorite, is The Will of the Many by James Islington. This is very reminiscent of my favorite series of all time, which yes is coming up in this video, but this one is following a young man who is entered into an academy to spy on the person who runs it. So his family have been killed by the government of this country, Catan, who are overtaking like all of the smaller countries around them and absorbing them into their system. And he has been orphaned because of this, and an influential man in Catan adopts him and trains him to go to this academy to spy on the person who runs it, because the guy who adopted him, Ulkisko, believes that this man is responsible for the death of his brother, and is also working on some like political machinations in the background, which is going to destabilize Ulkisko. Very brief, but as I said, we still have 30 books to go. My favorite thing about this one is the expansiveness of the world. Very similar to Brandon Sanderson, the world building is excellent. I never feel lost, I never feel confused, but the world is incredibly complex and it keeps expanding at a pace that is plausible, because you can like, there's definitely room for expansion within this world, but in a way where while you're reading it, you never feel like anything is missing, and it continues to expand and you just continue to absorb this knowledge. I don't feel like I articulated that very well. I loved everything about this. I have very little to critique about this book, but my absolute favorite thing about it was definitely how well the world was built. The last of the epic fantasies is The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. My camera battery is flashing red at me, so that's how long I've been filming this. But the last epic fantasy is Rage of Dragons. This one is following a man who lives in a society that are essentially just trained to be at war with this other kingdom that they've been taught are constantly attacking them. It's like a matter of their religion that they feel like they have to keep fighting these people. And our main character just wants a life of peace for himself so that he can settle down. However, he does end up doing his like compulsory drafting into this army, and he trains to be one of their most elite warriors. So the women of this world that are gifted can call down dragons to fight for them, and the men can kind of like absorb, I think it's the women that have to do it to them, but they can absorb the strength of a dragon and be like bigger, faster and stronger. My favorite thing about this is how flawed our main character is. He is selfish for a big part of it. Like, he doesn't want anything to do with this. He just wants to mind his own business and not contribute to society in the way that he's always been ingrained to do. However, after something incredibly tragic happens to him, he feels like he needs to take revenge on the people in this society that have wronged him, which is why he actually goes along with this to become this elite warrior. And along the way, he is constantly making terrible decisions, but in an incredibly human way. And then behind all of this as well, you have the plot that is continuously expanded as you learn a little bit more about the aggressors that are coming to attack this island constantly and the reason why they're doing that. I feel like it's been a long ass time since I've had to take a lunch break in the middle of filming a video, but here we are. Moving on from fantasy, I was undecided about whether we should go for sci-fi or fantasy romance. The sci-fi is a little bit more intense, so I think we will go with the fantasy romance to start off with. This is a much shorter stack than I thought that it was going to be. And the first one, I didn't necessarily read it solely because of Booktube, because I would have read this anyway. It would have been my most anticipated release of this year anyway, but I did get an arc because of Booktube, and this is a book that was very impactful on my channel overall, which is of course my favorite book of all time, House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J Maas. So I was a SJM stan before I joined Booktube, and we're not going to talk about books 2 and 3. We're only going to talk about book 1, House of Earth and Blood, and in my opinion you should at this point read this as a standalone. But House of Earth and Blood is following a half-fae woman called Bryce Quinlan, who is tasked with solving a string of murders. They previously thought that they'd caught the murderer, however after a 2-year period people are dying again, and because Bryce potentially has a personal tie to this case, she has been assigned the job, even though like she's not an investigator or anything. And because it's dangerous, she has also been assigned a personal bodyguard in the form of the fallen angel Hunt Athalar. My favorite thing about Sarah J Maas, with the exception of her last 3 releases, is that she has very compelling romances for me, with a lot of points of like high drama, where even though you kind of know everything's gonna be all right in the end, it feels life or death in the moment. And I think that that is my favorite thing about Sarah J Maas, but also the fact that she pairs this with a very good fantasy plot line. She's really good at plot twists. Obviously, when I've been reading fantasy romance in general, but more recently, I find that either the romance or the fantasy is more dominant, and I think that Sarah J Maas does a very good balance of both. And my favorite thing about this one in particular is the way the 2 main characters bond over their past trauma and work through that to build a friendship, which then eventually turns romantic. One of my favorite books of 2024 was The Crimson Moth by Kristen Cicerelli. This one is a witch hunter romance following a young woman called Rune who had to turn her own grandmother over to the witch hunters when she was a child. Now, since then, she has come into her own powers and she has become the Crimson Moth, which is a vigilante figure that saves witches from execution at the hands of witch hunters. However, she is chasing down a specific witch called Seraphine when she finds out that the witch hunters got there just slightly before her, and so she decides that she has to get closer to Gideon, who is the leader of the witch hunters, to try and figure out where he is holding Seraphine. On the flip side of this, Gideon has been tipped off that maybe Rune is the Crimson Moth that they've been looking for all this time, and so he decides to get closer to her to figure out if she is this vigilante figure. So my favorite thing about this one, the main characters, like with House of Earth and Blood, do bond over trauma and like grow closer in that regard, like while they work through it. But my absolute favorite thing about this one is the expressions of affection in this series, like the acts that they do for each other to show that they value each other, and also that it portrays a male victim of domestic abuse in a way which does not emasculate the victim or portray them in a way that this happened to them because they're weak or lesser or anything like that, which is a common stereotype associated with male victims of domestic and sexual abuse. One in graphic form is Lore Olympus by Rachel Smith. This one is a Hades and Persephone retelling, and it is a webcomic that has been bound up into, I think there's 7 installments so far. I'm not sure how many there are going to be in total, but I love the art style in this. It is predominantly telling the story of Hades and Persephone, but we do have a lot of the gods of Olympus present in here as well. And I mean, we'll just go straight into the thing that I love the most about this. It's that the relationship between Hades and Persephone in itself is incredibly wholesome, but while it modernizes things, makes them more relatable, makes them funny, like brings the kind of key characteristics of these gods into the 21st century, it does not shy away from any of the darker themes associated with Greek myth, such as domestic and sexual abuse, child abuse, and everything's kind of just brought up to date, which makes it feel a little bit more poignant to a modern reader. The first fantasy romance that I read after Sarah J Maas, so this was in 2020 and it was before Book Talk blew up, so fantasy romance wasn't a thing. We had been reading fantasy that had romance in it, like with Strange the Dreamer, but fantasy romance wasn't really a thing, and so I was going out of my way to try and find fantasy romance recommendations, and one that was highly recommended to me, partially based on its similarity to ACOTAR, is Rhapsodic by Laura Thalassa. I'm pretty sure that this is the first indie fantasy romance that I read, aside from one that I picked up when I was 20, just like on a whim for 99p from the Kindle store, that I don't really remember very much about, which was actually more of a historical paranormal romance. But this is the one that I first read when I was intentionally seeking out paranormal romance, and this one is a portal fantasy story following a woman called Callie who has black beads that wind all the way up her arms, with each... Apparently I hit my step goal, I can tell you I did not. With each bead representing a debt that she owes to the bargainer. So she actually hasn't seen the bargainer, and I think it's 7 years at the start of this series, which is really weird because I mean, it's very unusual to have more than one debt outstanding from the bargainer anyway, but he definitely always collects on the debts that he is owed. And one day, 7 years after she's last seen him, Desmond Flynn, who is the bargainer, comes back into Callie's life to reclaim the debts that she owes him. So this is told in dual timelines as well. We have the past, like when they first met and got to know each other, and also the present day when he's come to collect. And the reason why it's compared to ACOTAR is because Desmond Flynn is very much like Rhysand. And I have to say that is my favourite thing about it. Bearing in mind that this was the first fantasy romance that I read, like the first indie one. So I think that if I read this now, having read everything else that I have, I maybe wouldn't love it so much. But this is such a nostalgic one for me. And I think that if you are very new to fantasy romance and you're coming from like reading traditional stuff in Sarah J Maas, which is a little bit more unusual now that so much, especially indie stuff, has been traditionally published and fantasy romance is like the most popular genre. But if you were very new, I would recommend the Vargana series by Laura Thalassa. And I actually just really like Laura Thalassa in general. And one that is definitely because of my channel, I received an arc of this, or not an arc, but I received a copy from the author who then became a friend. And that is, of course, Fortuna Swan by KJ Sutton. So this was once again one of the very early indie fantasy romances that I read. And in this one, we are following Fortuna Swan, who is a nightmare. Her brother has gone missing prior to the start of this story, and she is about to give up hope when a very powerful fae male approaches her and tells her that he knows where her brother is and he will take her directly to him, providing that she marries him. So this is a fantasy romance series that has a bunch of different creatures. Fortuna's a nightmare, which means that she can manifest people's fears into reality. And we also have like there's Selkies, there's dragon shifters, and a whole ton of stuff in here. But the dominant characters, the male ones, are fae. And my favorite thing about this, I would say, is Fortuna herself. She's a deeply flawed character that I relate to a lot. She is incredibly loyal and cares a lot about the people around her, and she makes a lot of decisions with those people in mind that are not necessarily the smartest in the moment, but she just kind of like goes with her gut in a lot of instances, and I truly appreciate that about her. Also, I like how this is a little bit polarizing because we have multiple love interests in here, but if you ask me, I'm Team Colith and I will always be Team Colith. So this is of course a nice segue into romance, which is the last nice segue we are going to have throughout these sections of this video. But I just have one out of this stack that I would not consider a romance. Some of these lean more into contemporary fiction than they do straight up romance, but this one I would definitely say is firmly contemporary fiction, and it does have a sci-fi twist though, so it could have also gone there. But that is my favorite manga series, which is Orange by Ichigo Takano. So this one is the story of a group of friends in high school. The main character that we follow receives a letter that there is a new boy about to transfer to her class, and if she does not step in, if she doesn't befriend him, then he is not going to be around in the future. This is predominantly a story about mental health. It is about a boy who is very much struggling with his mental health, and this series does have its flaws because of course like your mental health is not something that your friends should be responsible for. Like your actions are your own, and it is on you to get yourself out of a bad place when you're in a bad place mentally, and you definitely shouldn't put that on other people. But I do really like the wholesome nature of this. I like the way that everyone bands together to try and help their friend. And I also love something actually, because I've started watching K-dramas very recently. I mean, if you know, you know, and I'm really interested to see who exposes themselves in the comments of the video based on this t-shirt. I really love stories that are contemporary with a slight sci-fi twist, like Lovely Runner, like Orange. And when I actually first got into K-dramas, I was like, this is like a TV version of the manga that I love. So I do think that is like, I've noticed it a lot in Asian media is like a very common thing. But I just thought that it was really wholesome and really heartwarming, and I got really emotionally invested in this one. While we're on the graphic front, we might as well cover Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. This one is once again a webcomic that was bound up into physical copies. I think, is the last one out, or is it the next one that's the last one? I can't remember because I haven't read the last volume that I have. But this is simply a story about two boys in high school. One is openly gay, one doesn't know that he's interested in boys, and they start a friendship which turns into a relationship. There are lots of content warnings for things like eating disorders and self-harm and things in here, because one of them especially does really struggle with their mental health. But aside from that, it is just this really wholesome story of these two boys and their relationship. It's all very innocent, all very wholesome, and like with Orange, it just makes me feel good. and that's why I enjoyed it. On to what is probably going to be one of the most polarizing books that I include in this video, and I have talked about this before, but it is essentially It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. Colleen Hoover is an author that I was seeing around like back when I started YouTube. The first book that I read from Colleen Hoover was November 9, which I love because it's just so entertaining. But a book that I especially adored when I read it is It Ends With Us. Now, this is in the romance section, but once again, I would not call this romance. I would call this contemporary fiction. And we are following a woman whose father dies, and on the night that her father's funeral takes place, she goes to blow off steam on the roof of this building and she meets this surgeon. They decide that they're going to have a one-night stand, but he is on call, so he ends up going to work, and she doesn't really think about him again, but 6 months later, they meet again and they start a relationship together. Now, we do also have a past timeline in here because throughout the process of moving around, the main character Lily finds her teenage diaries where she had a friendship with a homeless boy called Atlas. So we are looking into her relationship with Atlas, which is currently intersecting with her present day, as well as the relationship she is having with this man, the surgeon that she has just met. Big content warnings in here for domestic abuse, which forms a big thread throughout this. And my favorite thing about this, and I know that a lot of people will disagree, my interpretation when I read this many years ago, I think I read it in 2018, and my interpretation of it is that this puts you in the place of a woman who is in a very difficult position and makes you feel the way that she feels throughout the entire course of this relationship, including the good and the bad part. So it puts you in the place of somebody who might be in this situation and forces you to feel, obviously with a measure of distance, similar emotions. And Colleen Hoover actually also wrote this for her mother, who ended up in like a similar situation earlier in her life. And for that, I thought that it was especially poignant. And like I said, I know it is a subject of a lot of discussion. That is my interpretation of this. I think that it is especially powerful because it puts you in the shoes of Lily. For that reason, I loved it, and it's still one of my favorite books to this day. My favorite contemporary romance, though, is The Hating Game, and I can attribute this directly back to one person, which is Chelsea from Chelsea Darling Reads. Chelsea's channel, obviously, I've been here a while now, and people come and go. People create amazing content and then they just stop one day, and Chelsea's channel is honestly the one that I mourn the most, because even though Chelsea read a ton of romance at a time when I only read fantasy, I loved Chelsea's videos. And I want to thank Chelsea, who is probably not watching this. I want to thank Chelsea, if Chelsea is watching this, for bringing The Hating Game into my life, because this book lives in my mind rent free. I have talked about recently a lot how I love a He Falls First romance. Once again, throwing it back to Lovely Runner, and this was like kind of the clear romance that started it all for me. Like, I'm still gooped and gagged when I think about this. I picked this up to film this video and I saw this here and I was like about to lose my mind, and I need to reread this. I have a paperback copy for annotating, and I'm so excited to finally do that. But this is essentially a enemies to lovers, rivals to lovers office romance following two people who are very different. The guy, Josh, is very clinical, and our female main character, who I'm sure is called Lucy, is very creative. They both work at a publisher, but the publishers have merged, and one of them is more of like treating literature as an artistic pursuit, and the other one treats it as just like a way to make money. And these two very much embody those different like company ethoses. I think a promotion comes up at work and they are both in the running for it, so they both start to be even more awful to each other than they were to start off with, and I love it. My favorite thing about this, I think, is how blindsided I was by the way that this romance turned out. That's all I'm gonna say. I adore this. Like, I can't, this is one of my favorite books. A Booktube staple from back in the day that I read and enjoyed a lot was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I have also read Daisy Jones on the Six, and I really like the TV adaptation of that, but I think in terms of subject matter, I'm much more interested in old Hollywood than I am the music industry, and that is why The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo was the one of the two that I very much preferred. And this is about an aging starlet called Evelyn Hugo who has never really done any interviews in her life, and she invites a particular young woman to come and interview her, and the format format of the interview like follows the structure or the timeline of the 7 husbands that Evelyn Hugo had, because something that everybody wants to know is which of these husbands is the one that Evelyn loved the most. So Evelyn starts to tell her life story, and my favorite thing about this, which is true of Daisy Jones and the Six as well, even though I didn't love that one, is that Taylor Jenkins Reid has a talent in being able to make you think that these fictional people are real. They are both biography style books, and the way that it makes you feel like Evelyn Hugo is a real person and this is their real story and that you can look her up afterwards is the thing that I love the most about this one. This is also one heavily romantic, but I would generally consider it more contemporary fiction, I feel. One that is not a romance because it doesn't have a guaranteed happily ever after, but also very much is a romance, while also very much not being, is Magnolia Parks by Jessa Hastings. I read this a couple of years ago. I still need to continue on with this series, but Magnolia Parks and BJ Ballantyne live in my head rent free. The thing that really drew me to this is that it's a romance that isn't a romance. It is about these two people who were dating, and BJ cheated on Magnolia, so they broke up, and it was kind of like where they'd been childhood best friends and it was just inevitable that they would be together, but he ruined their relationship entirely. And so since then they have not maintained a healthy distance from each other. They actually torture each other. Like, Magnolia serially dates guys but never sleeps with them, and BJ serially sleeps with other women but doesn't date them, and then at the end of the night they crawl into the same bed together and sleep next to each other, and their relationship is so toxic. It's very Chuck and Blair. So if you were a Gossip Girl stan back in the day and you really like that dynamic, as problematic as it is, then I feel like Magnolia Parks is something that you will really love. So I really love, like I've discussed in various ways throughout this video, I love stories that are heavily romantic but aren't necessarily a romance, and I like the back and forth and the will they won't they of Magnolia Parks. But my favorite thing about this is the writing style, because everything is so dramatic. Like, the metaphor is so dramatic. The way that Magnolia talks about BJ is so dramatic. It's the kind of thing that I feel like I relate to a lot in terms of my teenage relationships. It's like, if he doesn't text me back in the next 3 minutes, then I'm just going to expire. Like, it's that level of dramatic emotion that I really enjoyed in this one. When did Brie open this door? This is one where I pulled up the sequel, or one of the sequels, instead of the first book in the series. But it's because it's a romance trilogy, and the second one in that trilogy is definitely my favorite, and that is Take a Hint, Danny Brown by Talia Hibbert. So this one is book 2 in the Brown Sisters series, which is a series of standalone romances following each of the Brown sisters. Now, I also really love the first book, which is, it's Chloe Brown, but what is the Get a Life Chloe Brown. However, Danny, I don't know why Danny hit for me just a little bit harder, but it really did. And this one is about Danny Brown, who has, like, not commitment issues necessarily, but she's not really interested in a romantic relationship. However, she would very much like a friends with benefits situation. So one day there is a fire drill, and I think she gets stuck in the lift, and the security guard, who's also a rugby player, carries her out of the lift, and they get like snapped and put on Twitter as soon as they exit the building, and there's a hashtag, it's like Dr. Rugby, and because of that they end up kind of in a fake dating situation where Danny is also getting her friends with benefits fixed. But our male main character Zaf is also a hopeless romantic, and he is determined to show Danny that her attitude to relationships is wrong. My favorite thing about the Brown Sisters series is the humor and the way that plays into the banter between the characters. I feel like the sexual tension between them is really good as well. I also didn't know that Talia Hibbert was British until I read this series, and I like that in terms of the humor, because I feel like the humor is very British throughout this. And then we have another one of my favorite romance authors. I would say probably my favorite contemporary romance author at this point, because I think I've probably read more of their books than any other contemporary author that I've read, and I do try and keep up with them. And that is, of course, Ali Hazelwood. So I have pulled out 2 books, because when I find something new that I love, I tend to think that my first instance of discovering it is the favorite, but then I also really like Love on the Brain. So I always say The Love Hypothesis is my favorite of these feminist books because it's the first one that I read, but I also really love this. I really feel like they're neck and neck, but these are a series of romances following main characters who are scientists. So I don't have the normal synopses on these, which is really unhelpful. I can't remember what area of science they're in The Love Hypothesis. These are also both like Rey, Kylo Ren fanfic, mix, which weirdly, when that's converted into contemporary romance, I really enjoy it, even though I hate Kylo Ren and I don't ship Reylo at all in terms of the actual characters. But this one is following a girl who is doing, I think she's a PhD student. She was dating a guy casually that her roommate and her best friend is interested in. So she lies to her friend and says that she's dating someone else, so her friend feels comfortable going for this guy that she's actually into. And when she says that she's on a date with this guy that doesn't exist, she gets caught by her friend working at the lab. So she grabs the closest guy she can find, who is a PhD advisor, tutor, and kisses him, and he agrees to fake date her so that her friend believes that she is actually dating him. And also he is struggling to get funds for some of his projects because the university thinks that he's a flight risk, and so him being in a relationship signals to the university that he's not going anywhere anytime soon. Once again, I'm pretty sure all of Ali Hazelwood's romances are he fell first, which, like I said, is my favorite trope. And then this one, if I remember correctly, is a scientist that gets a job at NASA working on some type of helmet, and she ends up paired up with this guy who is an engineer on the project that she went to college with, and she thinks that he hates her for some reason, and they're obviously forced into proximity together all of the time because they're working on the same project. Once again, he fell first. This has one of the best like love interest monologues I've ever read in my life. I loved it. So my favorite thing about Ali Hazelwood, the he fell first trope in all of the books, but also they're the kind of books that give me butterflies because I think the male main characters are just so devoted, and I really like that. So next up we will pivot, I guess, to a genre that I don't read a ton of, and that is the thriller and horror category. So I do like thrillers and horrors, mainly as like little palate cleansers, and I tend to enjoy them more because I don't read so many of them, so I'm not as familiar with the conventions of the genre as I am with fantasy. The first one is my favorite, Grady Hendrix, who is a horror author that I really enjoy, and that is My Best Friend's Exorcism. Now, I know a ton of people don't like Grady Hendrix. I am a big fan, and this one in particular is about a girl. They go to like a summer camp. I'm pretty sure it's like a group of friends, and one of them ends up possessed, so they end up having to perform an exorcism. Now, what I really love about Grady Hendrix's books is the concept of them all. I've only read 2, but I also own 2 more that I want to read, but I just find that the concepts are very different, and that is what draws me into them. So this one is set in the 80s. I love that the cover has the style of a VHS. The chapter titles are all like very popular 80s songs, and I'm also a big fan of 80s music. I love the aesthetic, and that is like probably my favorite thing about My Best Friend's Exorcism. It should be obvious going into horror, but because I guess the concepts are so gimmicky, something that I never really thought of with Grady Hendrix is that no, like they are actually kind of gory as well, and a little bit not scary. I think that they make me like do this more than they actually give me fear, and that this is definitely one of those. But yes, my favorite thing about this one is the vibe, the aesthetic, the 80s. Stunning. This one I can't tell you very much about. It is best that you go in blind, but I also would recommend looking up content warnings for this book, and it is what I would consider like a hybrid between a thriller and a horror. It's definitely got elements of both, and that is The Last House on Needless Street by Katrina Ward. This is another kind of polarizing one. People either love or hate this, and I definitely understand why. I don't even know how to describe this one. This is multi-perspective. We are mainly following a man called Ted who lives alone with his cat and his young daughter, and we are also following a woman whose little sister went missing many years ago. I can't remember exactly how many years it is before the start, but we essentially alternate between their perspectives, and the female main character whose sister went missing believes that this man Ted is responsible for her sister, so she ends up moving into a house, I think it's opposite his, so that she can watch him and get her sister back. My favorite thing about this is that I believed everything that was going on in this book, and it made me deeply uncomfortable. Like the way this made me feel, I hated reading this book because I felt so uncomfortable the entire way through, which obviously for a thriller or a horror is sometimes the desired effect, and it was done wonderfully in this. I completely understand, knowing what I now know about this book, why some people very much don't like it, but I thought that the way that Katrina Ward manipulates the reader into thinking what she wants you to think and feeling how she wants you to feel was 10 out of 10. I feel like all of these are actually quite polarizing in that they're things like that a lot of people either love or hate, but I guess that is also the nature of thriller and horror as a genre. This is one of my favorite series ever. I love it, and that is You by Caroline Kepnes. So this is a Netflix show now, and it is following a guy called Joe Goldberg who is a stalker, and it's written in second person perspective. So it's like, I watched you get on the train, I watched you in your window undressing. But essentially he works at a bookstore and this woman comes in called Beck, and from the moment he sees her, he's like, I have to have you, you're perfect, and he starts to stalk her while also pursuing a romantic relationship with her. I love this because putting you in the mind of the stalker obviously endears you to them. And like with The Last House on Needless Street, my favorite thing about this is Caroline Kepnes's manipulation of the reader, because some of the things that happen throughout this book, like you're on Joe's side, like you're rooting for Joe. You're like, you know what? I actually wouldn't be happy if this person did this to me. I would respond very differently and I would not stalk them. But I understand why this is something that would upset you. But obviously the he goes to extremes with it. The thing that I really like about this is that it puts you in the place of the person doing the bad thing and makes you kind of empathize with them and root for them, even while knowing that they are very much the villain in their own story. That very much is the overarching theme of the series, which is kind of Joe in a new predicament every time. At the point where this series is, like when I'm 4 books deep in it, I do think it is getting a little bit overly ridiculous, but I really, really love the first 2 books in this one. And then we have Night Film by Marisha Pessl. This is a book that should have ended 50 pages before it actually did, in my humble opinion, but I am somebody who hates ambiguous endings, and this very much does have one. So this is following a journalist who has a vendetta against a cult director. I think he's a director of horror films, but essentially the journalist like slandered this director on live television and his career was ruined because of that. He lost all of his credibility. I'm pretty sure that the director like sued him. So when the director's daughter dies, and while it's been written off as like dying, I think it's written off as like suicide, the main character thinks that something a little bit more sinister might have been going on here. So he starts once again to look into this director and how he could be responsible for the death of his own daughter. This is a story told in 3 parts. You have the beginning, which is where he's starting to like investigate this. The middle section is a fever dream. It's a wild ride. And then the last section of it is kind of discovering what actually happened and everyone kind of making their mind up about that particular thing. It is also mixed media as well, which is pretty cool. It is mainly like a normal book though, like the mixed media isn't super common. And the thing that I really liked about this is that you are on a wild ride with this guy, and this was one of the first thrillers that I read as well, so I was like believing everything that was presented to me and I was completely on his wavelength. And then it kind of offers like a super mundane solution that makes so much sense, but you've been like on this train of thought, the same train of thought as the main character the entire time, but you didn't even think about the actual information that's offered up as being like a completely plausible response. However, personally, I do think that it should have ended there, and the last 50 pages to make it more of a speculative note, I think really knocked this down from a 5 to a 4 for me. And then finally, we have the sci-fi. I say a lot that I really, really love sci-fi, but I just hardly ever read it. And this is actually very validating for me because I do keep doubting myself and I'm like, do I love sci-fi though? Like, I just feel like I can't think of any great sci-fi series that I've read recently and I've loved. Like, is this correct? No, it's correct. Like, I have a big old stack. I think my stack 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9. This is 20%. 20% of this video is sci-fi. So I have a big fan. But I do really need to read more and prioritize more, because some of the sci-fi series in this stack are some of my favorite series of all time. And we're going to be starting off with one that I really need to continue on with. It's one that once again lives in my head rent free, that I read a couple of years ago, I think towards the end of 2023. And that is of course Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. So this is a series that is notoriously very confusing. This is set in a universe where there are 9 necromantic houses, and we are following Gideon, who is a member of the Ninth. Now Gideon does not want to be a member of the Ninth and keeps trying to escape. And Harrow, who is the daughter, so like the heir of the 9th necromantic house, offers Gideon a deal that she will let her like go do whatever it is that she wants to do in the universe and she can be free, providing she steps in as a, what is the word, because I can never remember, cavalier, I think maybe. Essentially she wants Gideon to accompany her in this competition that is going to take place at the first necromantic house to become an immortal warrior called a revenant. Gideon accepts this bargain and they go to the first necromantic house, which is full of like these crumbling gothic castles, and they are given a task that is very confusing. It's kind of like, okay, there's puzzles in this place, like go figure it out. And as they're wandering around, it becomes a murder mystery as they start to die one by one. My favorite thing about this, the atmosphere, I think, and also the humor. Like I said, it is notoriously confusing. I listened to the audiobook and read it at the same time, would definitely recommend, but I actually really liked the level of complexity that we had in here combined with a really good atmosphere. And now of course we're going to talk about my actual favorite series of all time, which is Red Rising. And once again, 100% know who introduced me to Red Rising, the reason why it was on my radar, and that is the one and only Pierre Ford, who would not stop talking about this. And I'm so glad that I picked it up because I am obsessed. Like I think about Red Rising too much. Like every day I think about Red Rising at this point. But this is a sci-fi, it's like a sci-fi fantasy in that it's set in space, but the plot line is kind of like a martial fantasy. But we are following a man called Darrow, who is a red, which is the bottom tier of like a color caste system. So the golds are right at the top of this caste system, reds are right at the bottom, and he lives under the surface of Mars, where he is mining for a valuable substance that he believes is integral in humans terraforming the solar system so they can escape the dying planet Earth. However, after Darrow's wife makes herself a martyr to spur Darrow into action, he goes to the surface of Mars and he realizes that the planets have been terraformed for a really long time and his people are essentially being kept in slavery. So he then joins the rebellion and infiltrates the golds to tear them apart from the inside. I can't believe I still remember that synopsis, like word for word how I normally say it. Red Rising itself I gave 4 stars to. I didn't really warm up to this at all until I got halfway through, but when I did, it blew me away. My favorite books in this series are Golden Sun and Lightbringer. I am emotionally invested in this series. Like I care deeply about all of these characters, and like I said, I think about them every day. I sobbed throughout the end of Lightbringer. I was shooketh to my core at the end of Golden Sun. And my favorite thing about this, I would say, the found family element that we have here. Also the level of drama. It has a lot of Shakespearean drama, like people coming up to each other like and declaring blood feuds between their houses, and that resulting in like betrayal and backstabbing. And it also is a series that has consequences. A lot of characters die in this, and yes, it does hurt. And I'm really glad that Pierce Brown does not pull his punches in that regard, because I'm actually quite tired of reading series where like literally nobody dies. Another one of my favorite books is Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. This one is a dystopian series that is honestly, the more the world is progressing and the bigger AI is getting, the more I keep thinking about Ready Player One, if I'm being honest, because this is set in a futuristic version of our world, not too far in the future either. It's 2045. The world has gone to shit. Like the environment has collapsed. Like we're running out of resources, and everybody spends their time in a virtual world called the Oasis, where anything you want can happen. However, there is still very much a hierarchy. You have to have money to have a great time in this world. However, everyone like has access to it for free. So when the creator of the Oasis dies, it is announced that he has left an Easter egg hunt behind, and if you find the Easter eggs, then you will become the next creator or like owner of the Oasis. A lot of like forums have been dedicated to this. There's people who like dedicate their lives to searching for these Easter eggs, and this sort of story starts off when our main character finds the first one, and there is a company that has been created essentially just to find these Easter eggs, start chasing behind him and he has to stay ahead of the game to be the person that wins this competition as the creator intended, instead of this big company that has essentially been created to cheat the system. My favorite thing about this, as a gamer, I want to say it's the gaming element of it, the way that it references kind of like older video games. I thought that the Easter egg like little puzzles and stuff that went on in here were incredibly clever as well, and I think the whole Easter egg hunt element of it was my favorite. But I also think the way that a lot of science fiction does, the way this kind of mirrors elements of our society, and that currently like this is a possibility that I actually don't see too far in our future based on everything that's happening in the world, is something that I do think about a lot. I think that it was Ali from With Ali who introduced me to this series, but it is one that was incredibly popular on Booktube back in the day, and that is Saga by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. This was the first comic that I read and it still remains to be my favorite series. I am 11 volumes deep in this now, and I do think that the last 2 were not as good as the first 9, but I still love this so much. Like up until this point I didn't think that I could be emotionally attached to characters in a comic series as much as I am attached to Marco, Alana and Hazel. But this one is a Romeo and Juliet story set in space, following 2 people from a warring planet and moon who fall in love and have a baby. However, the governments of the planet and the moon don't want everybody to know that getting along is an option, and so they send bounty hunters to hunt down Marco, Alana and the baby and kill them before it like causes problems for their war. My favorite thing about this as the characters and the way that I connected to them in such like a small amount of pages, and how emotionally invested I got in this series throughout especially the first 9 volumes that I read. The second V. Schwab book in this video is Vicious, and this is the story of Victor and Eli, who were best friends in college, and together they invented extraordinaries, which are essentially superheroes. So they figured out a way to give people superpowers, and this story really kicks off when Victor has been released from prison and Eli has spent the last 10 years hunting down and killing extraordinaries. Now that Victor is out of prison, he has a bone to pick with Eli, and they end up causing a whole lot of chaos while they work out this animosity that they have for each other. So I have 2 favorite things about this. I really like the way that V. Schwab wrote the superpowers in here, because the way that extraordinaries are created is through near-death experiences, and the way that their powers manifest ties to an integral part of this near-death experience, and I like the way that those powers kind of manifested from their root source. The other thing that I loved is that the tension between Eli and Victor is palpable. Like you can feel how much they despise each other throughout this entire thing, and also how that's tied to an element of how much they have loved each other in the past, and I think that that really made me more involved in this story. There are 2 sci-fi stories in here that I feel like you would never expect me to like, so I'll talk about them like one after the other. The first one is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El Motar and Max Gladstone. Now when we were talking about the fantasy portion of this video, you may have noticed that I like things that are very much like plausible, very clearly plotted. You can see like the start, middle and end of all of the plot points as they come into fruition, and these 2 books are not like that. So This Is How You Lose the Time War is the story of 2 time travel agents that work for opposing agencies, and they are going to various points in time and doing things to try and manipulate the timeline to the specific needs and wants of the agency that they work for. However, throughout the course of this, these 2 agents keep meeting and leaving each other little clues and letters to pick up along the way, and end up building a relationship throughout this while working on 2 opposite sides of the time war. Now the reason why you wouldn't expect me to like this is because the science fiction is not the point of this, it's the relationship between them that is the point. And so if you think about it too hard, it doesn't really make sense because it's just like a snippet of a particular time. But I think my favorite thing about this is how with a small amount of pages, the authors really made that relationship flourish and made it feel so poignant, even though the backdrop that it was on, while making the story more interesting, was not executed in a way that I typically like my fantasy and sci-fi stories to play out. The other one is Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. So this one surrounds Area X, which is, I think it's got like a dome over it, but lots of expeditions of people have been sent into Area X to figure out what the hell is going on. Like nobody has a clue, and every time they send an expedition in, like they have different results. Like some of them killed each other and only one emerged, some of them got like terrible illnesses, some of them came out just like incoherent and apparently mad. And this is following the 13th expedition that goes into Area X to kind of figure out what's going on. Now this is quite surreal, and this is not the kind of clear-cut, well laid out, easy to understand world that I usually enjoy. It is very bizarre. You don't know what's happening most of the time. You're left to draw your own conclusions over things, and each book in this series is a little bit different. I think the first and the second ones are my favorite, but there is just something about this that I really enjoyed, despite it being a representation of things that I normally really intensely dislike in books. I think that it was so compelling in spite of it having these elements that I don't typically enjoy. And even though some questions were answered throughout the course of this, I ended up leaving the book with more questions that I had going into it, and I think that actually helped to heighten my enjoyment a little bit and keep me wanting to read in this series. One that has been one of my favorite series for a while is Scythe by Neil Shusterman. So this is a utopian series, which, as we know, utopian series tend to be dystopian series that are dressed up to look pretty, and that is what Scythe is. But this is set in a world where nobody dies. So we've conquered like every illness, we've conquered old age, and the only way that you can die is if you are gleaned by a scythe. And these scythes are a like government body that have been created to control the population, because that's the only thing that humanity currently has to face, is that the world is overpopulated. Each scythe is trained, like scythes take apprentices, take people under their wing, and the way that each scythe decides to glean, like the system that they use, as long as it is not biased in any way, is absolutely up to them. So in this series we are following Citra and Rowan, who are taken on as apprentices to the same scythe. However, it is very apparent that even though we live in this utopian society, that there is a lot of corruption still going on, especially within the scythedom, where you have the old guard who want to stick with the old ways of doing things, and the people who want to change things up a little bit from how things have always been done. And these two have a lot of animosity towards each other, and our main characters Citra and Rowan end up on opposite sides, like each on a different side of this conflict as it plays out throughout the series. My favorite thing about this, I think, is the speculative element of what this kind of future would be like, and how corruption persists no matter what. Like, humanity will never rid itself of problems, because just as a species, being discontent is ingrained in us. We always have to have a problem or something to work on. We can never be perfectly content. And my favorite elements of this book was kind of just exploring the world as it is and the problems that still arise, even though in theory everything has been fixed in humanity, like life should be perfect. Something that is a little bit, once again, more on the wholesome side for me is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. Now this one does have a plot, but it's not really about the plot of the book. It is about the relationships that are forged between the characters while the plot is happening. But this is following a crew on a ship that like punches holes in space to make 2 points of space closer together so you can travel through them faster, but they have to go the long way around to be able to make the tunnels that allow other people to travel faster. So I think we have one new person joining this crew that have been friends and like traveled together for quite some time, and they are going to this planet that has like either had some war on it or been part of a war that is now being folded into like the government body that like controls the universe, and they're going to be making that tunnel between the 2 points. However, like I said, it is actually about the relationships between the crew members while they are on this long journey. My favorite thing about Becky Chambers is their books essentially feel like a hug. Like, they feel warming to me. Like, I feel good when I read them. They are incredibly diverse and incredibly inclusive, and something that I've always really enjoyed about these is that they kind of speculate what would happen if we lived in a world where people were more open and actually accepting of each other, and if that wasn't an issue, like what would be an issue. It portrays people living in different ways, like for example polyamorous relationships, as like a normal part of society for different species, and the kind of questions and discussions that this throw up I find really interesting. So if you're looking for something that's like heartwarming, makes you feel good, and also gives you a lot to think about, I think you might enjoy Becky Chambers. And now I need to change my battery again. And then finally, book number 50 of my 50 favorite books I've read. Because of Booktube, we have The Illuminate Files by J. Kristoff and Amy Kaufman, and this is a great one to end on. I love this series. I remember how absorbed and engrossed I was when I was reading Illuminate for the first time. The audiobook for this is great because it's full cast, and it's probably one of the first audiobooks I ever listened to and actually enjoyed. And it is completely mixed media. So this is definitely the first book that I immersion read. I listened to the audio and read the book at the same time because I didn't want to miss any of the diagrams and stuff, but also wanted to take advantage of the full cast audio. And this is the story of a group of teenagers. The characters in this first book especially, they used to be in a relationship, but they've broken up, and their planet is attacked by this enemy ship. So they all flee, and our two main characters end up on different ships that are moving to try and escape this ship that is still following them, but they are moving at a slower speed than the ship that's following them, so you know that they're going to catch up eventually. This also has a horror element in it that I was not expecting, that kind of hits halfway through the book. That took me by surprise. It was also my first experience of sci-fi horror, which is like a genre blend that I really enjoy, like in The Immortality Thief by Taron Hunt. Very similar actually, I feel, in that regard. But I remember just being on the edge of my seat because the audiobook, as well as being full cast, because it's transcripts and stuff, it very much is more like an audio play than it is an audio book. And just the tension that I felt when reading this was unparalleled. It was one of the most engaging reading experiences in my life, where I felt like I could not stop reading this book because I needed to know what happened. The novelty kind of wore off a little bit by the time we got to the third book, because each book is following like a different set of teenagers adding on to this story, because I think they're comprising a list of documents to present in like the trial of whether, because I think it's like a very influential company or something that was trying to wipe this planet off the map for like overall it was for financial gain, and they're presenting their argument as to like what actually happened. So it was like a lot of the same by the end of the series, and my favorite book is Illuminate. I really love Gemina as well though, but it was just at the time especially such a unique reading experience, and I would actually really love. I mean, going through this, I have really enjoyed talking about all these books that I've loved, and I've highlighted so many that I'm like, oh my god, like I would love to reread this, and this is definitely one of them. I would love to reread this at some point because I had such a good time with it, and obviously you can't replicate that experience because I know a lot of what happens now, so it won't take me by surprise like it did for the first time. But I had such a good time with this that I actually remember where I was and what I was doing when I was reading sections of this book. So those... Oh no. That is just really what we needed to end this video. The final empire getting splattered with a little bit of coke. Just gonna clean up. I'll be back in a second. Don't worry guys, no books were harmed in the making of this video. They nearly were, but we did okay. The crisis has been averted. But anyway, as I was trying to say, these are my 50 favorite books that I have read because of Booktube. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I feel like I knew this was going to be a long one, but I definitely underestimated how long this was going to be. On top of the next video you're going to see on my channel, that's a lot of content I have to edit. I'm going to be real about that. But thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for 50k. Thank you for supporting my channel and watching my videos and interacting with my content. I appreciate you all, and I am very grateful to have been able to curate this community on the internet where I just get to talk about things that I love and sometimes things that I don't love. That's life. But then we have times like this where I just get to gush about all of the things that I love, and I feel like this has been really like healing for me which sounds really dramatic, but just dwelling in the good instead of the bad for once, I feel like was really good for me during the process of filming this video. Probably going to change my mind when it comes to editing it, but I'm going to make this outro as short as possible because we've been here for a long time. Down in my comments, let me know if any of these are also your favorite books, because I would like to spread the love throughout the comments, or maybe recommend a book that you think that I would like based on all of the ones that I already love. But aside from that guys, if you would like to let me know that you were here but you don't feel like you have anything to say, leave me a space related emoji down in the comments to represent the sci-fi section, which was the end of this video. But aside from that guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you will find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram and my Patreon if you would like to join me on any of those. But that's it from me today guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.